How could an entire Roman legion, 5,000 battle-hardened soldiers, simply vanish into the mists of northern Britain? The popular answer often sounds like a heroic epic. They bravely marched into the mountains of Scotland and fell in a final glorious battle against barbarian hordes. But what if I told you that this version is merely a beautiful lie, a convenient smokescreen for something far more prosaic and terrifying? This isn't a tale of heroic defeat. Instead, it's a genuine Roman cold case, a tangled mystery where the key piece of evidence lay hidden for nearly 2 millennia. I invite you to step beyond being a mere spectator and become an investigator. Together, we'll crack the code of this imperial silence and unearth the truth Rome itself tried to bury forever. For a moment, let's cast aside our maps and dates and transport ourselves to that very edge of the known world, northern Britain, at the dawn of the 2nd century. The air here is thick and raw, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the acrid peat smoke curling from the low-slung huts of the local tribes. This aroma blends with the wet wool of 1,000 soldiers' cloaks, the cheap sour wine they drink for warmth, and the ever-present metallic tang of armor and weaponry. The hum of city life is almost non-existent here. Instead, there's the perpetual creak of leather harness straps, the rhythmic clatter of hobnailed caligae on the muddy track, and the guttural Latin commands of centurions, swallowed by the murmur of dozens of dialects from Gallic to Thracian. This is not Italia. This is Caledonia, the green desert, where every hill and every forest watches with silent menace. Accustomed to the crisp lines of their roads, the geometric precision of their aqueducts, and the steadfast logic of stone, the Romans found themselves in a world that defied the very concept of order. Endless, primeval forests, perfect for ambushing an entire cohort. Treacherous bogs capable of swallowing a supply train whole, mules and all. And the eternal drizzling rain seeping beneath their armor, rusting their swords, and, most terrifyingly, slowly eroding from their souls the very confidence in Rome's might. This land did not wish to be conquered. It didn't fight openly. It simply absorbed. The legionaries here were not conquerors, but rather an alien body that the wild landscape strove to reject with every fiber of its being. To survive in such a world, mere courage was not enough. 2 immutable codes were deeply ingrained in the mind of every Roman soldier. The first was disciplina, discipline. More than simple obedience to orders, it was an almost religious conviction that order was stronger than chaos. It was the daily ritual of constructing a perfectly fortified camp even after an exhausting march. It was polishing one's weapon to a gleam even when hands ached with cold. It was absolute trust in the centurion standing beside you. Discipline was the inner core that prevented the legion from dissolving into chaos in this hostile, amorphous environment. The second code, even more sacred, was the aquila, the legion's eagle. Far more than a mere standard, it was the physical embodiment of the unit's soul and honor, a divine gift from Jupiter himself. To lose the eagle in battle was tantamount to collective suicide. Such a legion would be disbanded, its name struck from every roll, and its survivors forever branded with eternal shame. The aquilifer, the standard-bearer carrying the eagle, was the most protected and revered figure in the ranks. The legion lived only as long as its eagle survived. This is precisely why the story about to unfold is so critical. It will all revolve around the fate of this piece of gilded bronze. If we try to find a modern analogy, Rome's conquest of Britain wasn't a blitzkrieg. It was a grueling and incredibly expensive infrastructure project in hostile territory. Imagine a massive corporation trying to build a factory and establish communications in a lawless region where the local population wages guerrilla warfare. The 9th Legion, in this scenario, was not merely a military unit. It was a team of elite crisis managers dispatched to stabilize the most unprofitable and dangerous asset of Corporation Rome. They bore a colossal responsibility, and the price of failure was unfathomable. And so, in this misty purgatory, At the nexus of imperial order and primal chaos, the 9th Hispana Legion, veterans of dozens of wars, was about to confront an enemy that refused to play by the rules of civilized warfare. The Romans brought their roads, their baths, and their laws to northern Britain. But Caledonia had only one thing prepared for them: eternal and silent oblivion. Our drama's starting point wasn't a single day, but a grueling, protracted ordeal. By 117 Common Era, the northern frontier in Britain had ceased to be a mere line on a map. It had become a festering wound on the empire's body. This was a war without great battles or glorious victories. Roman patrols would disappear into the forests, never to return. Small outposts, painstakingly built, would blaze into funeral pyres by night. Merchant caravans, carrying grain and wine northward, dissolved without a trace into the mists. Rome, the greatest military power in the world, faced a problem it couldn't solve with brute force. It was mired. The engine of this story wasn't a charismatic chieftain or a brilliant general, but an idea born in the wild mountains of Caledonia itself. The local tribes, whom the Romans contemptuously called Picts, the painted ones, unveiled an utterly revolutionary concept of warfare. They understood the fundamental truth. To defeat Rome, one didn't need to fight its legions. One needed to fight its order. They abandoned the very notion of a decisive battle where the Roman war machine was invincible. Their weapons were not swords, but patience. Their fortresses, not walls, but bogs and mists. This new strategy was incredibly bold and utterly alien to Roman thinking. Instead of raising armies, the Picts weaponized their very land. They became ghosts, elusive and ubiquitous. They didn't attack a legion head-on. They struck its supply trains, killed its foragers, poisoned its wells. They wore the Romans down, not with pitched battles, but with the endless anticipation of a blow that could come from behind any tree, from any hill. This was a war of attrition, aimed not so much at the legionaries' bodies as at their souls, at their belief in their own invincibility. Rome's response to this improper war was predictable and arrogant. To the imperial administration, accustomed to clear reports of captured cities and routed armies, Pictish tactics were simply barbaric hooliganism, a bothersome nuisance. In Rome and Londinium, irritation mounted. How long could these mosquito bites on the body of a mighty giant be tolerated? The solution seemed obvious: enough defensive operations. What was needed was one powerful, crushing blow that would eradicate this pestilence once and for all. A punitive expedition was required. For this mission, the finest instrument available to the empire in Britain was chosen: Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Hispanic Legion. The name itself instilled awe. Veterans who had passed through fire and water under the command of Caesar himself in Gaul, who had quelled rebellions in Judea and fought the Germanic tribes on the Rhine. They were more than just soldiers. They were a living symbol of Roman military glory. Sending the 9th Legion north into the heart of Caledonia was not just a military operation. It was an imperial ultimatum, a loud declaration: "We are tired of playing your games. We are coming to end this war." For contemporaries, this decision was entirely logical and raised no doubts. Soldiers of other British legions, exhausted by endless frontier duty, watched the 9th march north with a mix of envy and relief, thinking, "Finally, the old guard will show these barbarians how to fight." Roman colonists in southern Britain breathed a sigh of relief, anticipating the swift and final pacification of the wild lands. No one in their right mind could have imagined that an elite unit capable of crushing any army in the ancient world could face something it couldn't handle. But then, something happened that had the effect of a delayed action bombshell. After the 9th Legion, gleaming with eagles and standards, vanished into the Caledonian forests, no news came back. A week passed, then a month. Silence. A suffocating, absolute silence from the north. This silence was more terrifying than any report of defeat. It meant something unthinkable had occurred. something beyond all of Rome's military experience. The province's greatest legion had not been defeated. It had simply disappeared. To understand how the Ninth Legion vanished, we must abandon conventional notions of warfare. The Roman war machine was a marvel of engineering, a perfectly tuned mechanism of destruction. But in Caledonia, it encountered not another mechanism, but a hostile ecosystem operating under entirely different laws. Let's introduce our central metaphor. Pictish warfare was not a shield wall, but green quicksand. It was a strategy that didn't break the enemy. It slowly and inexorably swallowed them whole. And now, we'll look under the hood to see how this diabolically effective system worked. At the heart of it all lay an absolute intimate knowledge of the land. For a Roman legate, the map of Caledonia was a blank slate with sparse markings of forts and conventional symbols for forests and hills. For a Pictish chieftain, that same land was a living, breathing organism. He didn't just see a forest, he knew every trail warriors could use to move unseen. He didn't just see a bog, he knew the single safe causeway surrounded by quicksand where a Roman patrol could be lured. They read the mists, predicted the rains, and used the acoustics of gorges to sow panic. The Romans were blind and deaf here, while the Picts had thousands of eyes and ears. The main principle of their tactics was to disregard the enemy's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. The legion's strength lay in its formation, in its phalanx, in its ability to act as a unified whole on open ground. Consequently, the Picts did everything to ensure such a battle never occurred. They transformed their own strengths, their intimate knowledge of the landscape, into weapons. A forest became an arsenal of javelins. A narrow gorge turned into an ideal firing position where rocks and spears could rain down with impunity on a slowly crawling column from above. Rain and fog were their best allies, concealing movements and muffling sounds, turning Roman reconnaissance into a fiction. Now, let's visualize the process of the legion's absorption itself. Step 1. Lure and stretch. The Picts did not impede the Ninth Legion's advance deep into their territory. On the contrary, they created the illusion of easy progress. The Romans marched day after day, encountering no serious resistance, moving further and further from their bases and supply lines. The legion, strung out for miles along narrow forest trails, ceased to be a monolithic fist. It transformed into a long, vulnerable serpent, its head unaware of what was happening to its tail. Step 2. Attack the nervous system and blood supply. The Picts never attacked the main combat cohorts. That would have been suicide. Their targets became the most vulnerable elements. Foraging parties sent out for food, scouts dispatched ahead, and most crucially, the supply trains carrying provisions and equipment slowly crawling in the rear. Each such strike was a small but extremely painful operation. It didn't inflict fatal damage on the legion, but it starved them, deprived them of arrows and javelins, and most importantly, sowed fear. Soldiers understood that even deep within their column's rear, they were not safe. Step 3. War of attrition and psychological terror. Once the legion was sufficiently stretched, exhausted, and demoralized, the final stage began. Short, furious raids from nowhere. A group of warriors, painted blue, would appear from the fog with wild screams, unleash a hail of javelins on the column's rearguard, and then dissolve back into the forest before a centurion could organize a defense. At night, blood-curdling yells and the sounds of war horns would echo around the Roman camp, denying the soldiers sleep, keeping them in a state of perpetual tension. The legion slowly bled out, losing men not by dozens in a single battle, but one by one, two by two, every single day. Ultimately, the green quicksand did its work. Disciplina, that towering Roman discipline, proved useless when there was no enemy to strike back against. Formations dissolved. Confidence bled into despair. The perfectly oiled war machine, starved of fuel, intelligence, and rest, simply ground to a halt in the heart of the hostile forest, rusting away beneath an endless rain. The Picts didn't defeat the Ninth Legion. They engineered conditions under which it simply could no longer exist as a fighting force. They didn't destroy it. They dissolved it. We often speak of legions, cohorts, and empires, forgetting that behind these grand pronouncements stand living, breathing people. Let's take a moment to picture a common soldier of the Ninth Legion, say Gaius Valerius from Tarraco, Spain. Over 10 years of service, he had marched a distance equivalent to the journey from modern-day Madrid to Moscow. And all this in heavy armor, armed with his pilum spear, his gladius sword, and carrying nearly 66 pounds of gear on his shoulders, including digging tools, a cooking pot, and a 3-day supply of grain. He did this not for some abstract ideal of Rome, but for very tangible things: a steady wage, a share in the spoils of war, and most importantly, for the glory of his commander and the honor of his eagle. Now, this man, accustomed to facing the enemy head-on in an open field, found himself in a cold, damp forest where the foe was invisible, and death could strike without warning from behind any tree. The grandeur of Alexander the Great would have been impossible without his quartermaster Parmenion. Caesar's success, impossible without his chief engineer, Mamurra. So too in this tale, there were unsung heroes whose names never made it into the annals, but without whom disaster would have struck far sooner. One such pivotal figure was the camp prefect, the Praefectus Castrorum. This was typically the oldest and most experienced primus pilus centurion, having risen to the highest non-commissioned officer rank. For our purposes, let's call him Lucius Sergius. He didn't lead cohorts into battle. His war was of a different kind. Every evening, after an exhausting march, he was the one responsible for ensuring that, within mere hours, a perfectly fortified camp, complete with ditch, rampart, and palisade, sprang up from nothing. He oversaw the distribution of provisions, the organization of patrols, and the repair of equipment. While the legate planned strategy, Lucius Sergius ensured the legion's very survival. And when supply lines began to falter, it was on his shoulders that the impossible task fell: to feed 5,000 hungry and increasingly desperate men in the heart of hostile territory. Another unassuming yet vitally important figure was the aquilifer, the standard-bearer, the keeper of the eagle. Let's suppose his name was Marcus Trajan Silvanus. He was not merely a strong soldier. This was a position demanding an unimpeachable reputation and nearly fanatical devotion. In battle, he stood in the thick of the fighting, shieldless, as both his hands were occupied with the precious standard. But in Caledonia, his role shifted dramatically. He ceased to be a symbol of impending victory and became instead the focal point of the entire legion's anxiety. Every glance the soldiers cast his way was filled not with hope, but with dread. They saw in him not a promise of glory, but a walking target, the primary objective of an unseen foe. Marcus Trajan Silvanus carried on his shoulders not merely a piece of gilded bronze, but the entire weight of his comrades' collective fear and despair. Now, for one striking mundane detail that anchors this entire story and truly reveals the depth of their despair. Part of every legionary's equipment was a sickle. Originally, it was meant for gathering fodder for pack animals. But in the guerrilla warfare of Caledonia, it found a new, horrifying application. Moving along narrow forest trails, the soldiers used these sickles to hack their way through dense undergrowth and tall grass. Picture this scene. Elite warriors of the world's greatest army, forged to crush enemy phalanxes, forced, like mere peasants, to clear their own path, every second anticipating an ambush. This transformed them from hunters into the hunted, from conquerors into cornered fugitives. The Roman war machine was broken not by a sword, but by thorny thickets and ubiquitous mud. The punitive expedition of the Ninth Legion was initially built upon one simple assumption. Sooner or later, the barbarians would buckle, gather all their forces, and give battle in a decisive engagement. All Roman tactics, all their logistics and psychology were honed for precisely this scenario. But that moment never came. Instead, the legion encountered a perfect storm, a confluence of factors for which it was utterly unprepared. Endless rains turned trails into impassable quagmires, slowing their advance to just a few miles a day. Dysentery, caused by bad water, began to plague the camp. And crucially, the enemy never showed their face, persisting with tactics of small, debilitating skirmishes. A system designed for a powerful and swift strike became bogged down and began to fail. And here, the core dialectic of strength and weakness revealed itself. That very iron disciplina that made the legion invincible in open battle became its Achilles' heel in guerrilla warfare. A Roman soldier was trained to operate as part of a single, cohesive mechanism to follow orders and maintain formation. He was not trained to make independent decisions in the chaos of a forest ambush, when the centurion was dead and the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. The cohesion, built on strict hierarchy and order, turned into fragility. When order vanished, when it became impossible to form a manipulae and launch a coordinated attack, the legionaries transformed from elite fighters into a confused, terrified mob. Their strength only worked in a predictable environment, and the Picts created an environment of absolute unpredictability. The crucial moment arrived when the legate, commanding the legion, realized a terrifying truth. He had lost the war without ever having fought a single battle. His legion was bled dry, demoralized, and food supplies were dwindling. To return south in disgrace, reporting the failure of a punitive expedition, was unthinkable. It would mean the end of his career and an indelible stain on the Ninth's reputation. To continue the meaningless advance northward was pure suicide. The legion found itself trapped, caught between the hammer of guerrilla warfare and the anvil of its own imperial ambitions. In this desperate situation, a decision was made that became the unexpected turning point. Instead of trying to save the entire legion, the command decided to save its honor. The number one priority became the evacuation of the Eagle, the sacred Aquila. A small, most combat-ready part of the legion, a vexillation consisting of several hundred of the best soldiers, was formed. Their mission was to break through to the south at all costs, carrying with them the soul of the legion, while the main forces, scattered across small garrisons and temporary forts, attempted to stem the rising chaos, covering their retreat. This was an act of supreme desperation, the legion sacrificing its body to save its soul. The remaining 4,000+ men were, in essence, condemned. They were abandoned to their fate in the heart of enemy territory. Divided into small detachments, without communication, without hope of reinforcement, they were doomed. One by one, their temporary forts fell. One by one, their patrols vanished into the forests. This was no longer war, but an agony. The slow, agonizing demise of a great legion, betrayed and forgotten by its own command for the sake of saving a symbol. This desperate plan to save the Eagle actually worked. The small detachment managed to break through the Pictish lines and carry the standard back to Roman-controlled territory. But at what cost? The legion's honor was formally saved. Its Eagle did not fall into enemy hands. Yet the legion itself ceased to exist. Thousands of soldiers were sacrificed for a piece of metal. And here, knowing this fact, we come to the main, lingering question. If the Eagle was saved, then why did the Ninth Legion still vanish from history? Why did Rome pretend it had never existed, if formerly the greatest disgrace, the loss of the Aquila, had been prevented? History, unlike mathematics, rarely offers single definitive answers. And it would be intellectually dishonest to claim that our version of the Legion's slow dissolution is the only one. There's another, more recent academic theory. According to it, the Ninth Legion was not destroyed in Britain. It suffered horrendous losses, was withdrawn to the continent for refitting, and then sent east, where it met its end in Judea during the Bar Kokhba revolt around 132 AD. This version elegantly explains the artifacts bearing 9th Legion symbols found in Nijmegen, Netherlands, but it has its own weakness. There is no direct written or archaeological evidence of the entire legion's presence in Judea during that period. So, the mystery persists. But whichever version we accept, the economic scale of the catastrophe remains colossal. The loss of a legion wasn't just a tactical setback. In modern terms, it would be equivalent to simultaneously decommissioning an aircraft carrier and bankrupting a major state-owned corporation. Let's do the math. The annual maintenance of a single legion, including the wages for 5,000 soldiers, provisions, fodder for hundreds of mules, and the depreciation of armor, weapons, and siege engines, cost the treasury an amount comparable to building dozens of miles of strategic road or a major aqueduct. Now, multiply that by the invaluable combat experience of veterans, which money simply cannot buy. The 9th Legion wasn't just an expense, it was a multi-billion-dollar asset on the Empire's balance sheet. Its loss became a financial black hole. It is precisely this economic catastrophe that explains Rome's subsequent actions, which were laden with hidden meanings. When Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and ordered the construction of his famous wall, it wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of desperation, disguised as a demonstration of strength. Hadrian's wall wasn't just a barrier of stone and turf. It was a gigantic memorial carved into the very body of Britain. A memorial not to victory, but to a limit. It was a public, physical admission. We will go no further. This land is cursed. We are cutting it off from the civilized world. Building the wall was the most expensive way to acknowledge defeat without uttering the word aloud. Even more intriguing is the symbolism of the legion's disappearance from the official records. Why couldn't Rome simply admit that it had suffered heavy losses and been disbanded? Because for imperial propaganda, the myth of the invincibility of Roman arms was more important than the truth. To concede that a handful of barbarians could effectively destroy an elite legion would have created a dangerous precedent. It would have been a signal to all barbarians on all frontiers: Rome can be defeated. Therefore, a different path was chosen, one far more subtle and, in its own way, ingenious. The 9th Legion was not declared dead. It was simply lost in bureaucratic documents. Its number was no longer assigned to new legions. Historians stopped mentioning it. It was erased. This was an information operation of titanic scale. Instead of a story of shameful defeat, Rome created a myth of mysterious disappearance, leaving future generations to invent heroic versions. And Hadrian's Wall became the final punctuation mark in that sentence, a stone seal on the empire's greatest military secret. And now, having seen the tactics of green quicksand, the psychological breakdown of Roman discipline, and the desperate dash of a handful of soldiers saving the eagle, the picture begins to achieve a chilling clarity. We have gathered all the evidence: scattered gravestones in Holland, a wall built from imperial fear, and of course the most crucial piece of evidence, a ritually buried eagle with broken wings found hundreds of miles from the supposed site of the tragedy. All the threads of this 2,000-year-old cold case converge at one point. But they point not to a glorious death in battle, but to something far more subtle and brutal. This leaves us with the ultimate paradox. If the eagle was saved, if the legion's honor wasn't formally stained by its capture, then why was the 9th Legion consigned to oblivion? Why couldn't Rome simply declare the legion suffered heavy losses in a brutal campaign, but its standard was saved, glory to the heroes? The answer to this question unravels the entire enigma, and it is more terrifying than any tale of massacre in mist-shrouded mountains. The truth is, for Rome, some fates were worse than military defeat, and one of those was shame. So, what is the key to the 9th Legion's mystery? It wasn't simply defeated. Its true genius, its downfall, and its destiny lay elsewhere. The 9th Legion wasn't annihilated by the Picts in one decisive battle. It was methodically, slowly, and agonizingly dismantled by them. It lost what made it a legion: its discipline, its combat readiness, its belief in victory. It transformed from a formidable war machine into a shattered collection of exhausted, starving, and terrified individuals incapable of carrying out their assigned tasks. To the imperial bureaucracy, a 9th Legion returning from Caledonia in such a state would have been a living, breathing monument to disgrace. It would have been proof that the Roman military system had its limits. And so, a decision was made, one as brilliant as it was monstrous in its pragmatism. To bury this ignominy, the Legion couldn't merely be disbanded, it had to be erased. Its very memory had to be obliterated. This was not a military operation, but an administrative one. The surviving remnants of the Legion, those several hundred soldiers who broke through to the south and perhaps scattered groups from other garrisons, were covertly withdrawn from Britannia. They weren't celebrated as heroes who had survived hell. Instead, quietly, without fanfare, they were dissolved into other legions stationed along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Picture this process unfolding. A centurion from the 9th Spanish Legion receives orders for the 3rd Gallic Legion somewhere in Germania. His past service vanishes from his records. His old comrades find themselves scattered across an entire continent. They were, most likely, forbidden under pain of severe punishment from ever speaking of what transpired in Caledonia. Over a span of several years, veterans retired, they died, and the last living memories of the 9th Legion vanished with them. It was a perfect, bureaucratic annihilation. This, then, explains the fate of the Silchester Eagle. The few who carried it out of the Caledonian hell understood they bore the soul of an already deceased body. Their legion, to which they had sworn allegiance, had ceased to exist by Rome's own decree. And so they performed the only act of farewell available to them. They didn't surrender the eagle to a temple where it would have stood as a silent reproach. Instead, they secretly buried it in a peaceful town far from the accursed north, and they broke its wings. This was not an act of vandalism. It was a valedictory ritual, a symbol that the flight of this great legion was over forevermore. It was its funeral, orchestrated by its last surviving sons. So, who truly destroyed the 9th Legion? The Picts dealt it a mortal wound, breaking its backbone and its spirit. But the final fatal shot was fired by the Roman Empire itself. To preserve the myth of its own invincibility, Rome coldly sacrificed the memory of 5,000 of its soldiers, performing a Damnatio Memoriae, a condemnation of memory, upon them. This isn't merely a military history. This is a thriller about how a faceless state apparatus, in protecting its own image, can not only kill, but also erase thousands of human lives from reality itself. It's a design of titanic, almost divine cynicism to rewrite the past in order to control the present. The disappearance of the 9th Legion unleashed a chain of consequences, a domino effect still felt today. The first and most obvious consequence was Hadrian's Wall. This monumental construction didn't merely cleave the island of Britannia in two, it forever etched the mental map of the region. South of the wall, Romano-British civilization flourished, integrated into the global Mediterranean world. To the north, the distinctive, wild and unconquered Celtic world persisted. This wall became the physical embodiment of a cultural fault line, which would later, in the Middle Ages, evolve into the border between England and Scotland. The political map of modern-day Great Britain is, in a sense, a direct legacy of the catastrophe that befell the 9th Legion. Even today, we unconsciously use the legacy of this story. The very concept of the last frontier, that wild border where civilization clashes with barbarism, has become one of the most potent archetypes in Western culture. From the American frontier and tales of the Wild West to sci-fi narratives of cosmic colonists battling hostile aliens, the shadow of the 9th Legion looms large. The story of valiant soldiers vanishing into misty wastes has evolved into a universal myth about the collision of order and chaos. It lives on in novels, movies, and video games, each time reminding us of civilization's fragility in the face of raw nature and an unconquered spirit. Furthermore, the very tactics that doomed the Legion have become a classic of military strategy. What the Picts intuitively invented would later be called asymmetric warfare or guerrilla tactics. The Viet Cong battling the US, army in the Vietnamese jungles, Afghan mujahideen fighting Soviet forces in the mountains, all, in essence, employed the same quicksand strategy as the ancient Caledonians. They avoided decisive battles, attacked supply lines, and leveraged their local knowledge to exhaust and demoralize a technologically superior foe. The Ninth Legion's story became the first and perhaps most brutal lesson for all empires. Brute force is powerless when the very land becomes your enemy. But here lies the main paradox of this legacy. The initial idea to conceal a shameful defeat and erase the Legion's memory eventually transformed into its complete opposite. The administrative annihilation conceived by Rome failed. Instead of sinking into oblivion, the Ninth Legion became immortal. It was precisely the mystery of its disappearance, the void left on the pages of history, that gave birth to the legend. If Rome had honestly recorded in its chronicles, Legio IX Hispana was defeated in Caledonia and disbanded, we would remember it no more often than dozens of other legions. But the bureaucratic attempt to forge a perfect past led to the birth of one of history's most compelling and enduring myths. Rome sought to bury its shame, but instead gifted it eternal life. This story is a prime example that history possesses a peculiar sense of humor. It doesn't tolerate attempts to falsify or sanitize it. Any endeavor to create a vacuum in the past inevitably leads to that space being filled with legends, conjectures, and myths that prove far more resilient and influential than any official version of events. Thus, the Vanished Legion became one of history's most renowned, forever remaining a symbol not of imperial shame, but of a great and unsolved mystery. At first glance, the tale of a legion swallowed by the mists 2,000 years ago might seem like merely a captivating yet distant ancient thriller. But this impression is deceiving. In reality, the drama of the Ninth Legion is a perfect mirror, reflecting the most pressing issues of our own time. Replace the Roman Empire with any modern superpower or colossal corporation, and substitute the elusive Picts with a nimble startup disrupting a market, a decentralized network of activists shifting public opinion, or an asymmetric threat against which traditional armies are powerless. The picture will prove eerily familiar. We live in an era where grand, cumbersome systems built on hierarchy and rigid rules increasingly face challenges that operate on the principles of a swarm, a network, or a virus. These challenges lack a clear center. They cannot be defeated with one powerful blow. And just like Rome, our modern empires often find themselves trapped by their own success. Their procedures, their strategies, their very mindset are honed for the wars of the past. They excel at building walls, but are utterly unprepared when the enemy learns to seep right through them. And here, the story's main, non-trivial lesson crystallizes. The greatest danger to any powerful system, be it a state or a business empire, is not an external enemy. It is its own inability to adequately process information about failure. When a system becomes so massive and so convinced of its infallibility, it begins to perceive any setback not as an opportunity for analysis and adaptation, but as an existential threat to its image. And at that moment, it makes a fatal choice. Instead of curing the illness, it starts to hide the symptoms. That's precisely what Rome did. It chose to preserve the beautiful myth of invincibility, sacrificing truth and the memory of thousands of its soldiers in the process. The bureaucratic Damnatio Memoriae imposed on the Ninth Legion isn't merely an act of ancient politics. It's the eternal temptation of all power, to control the past, to justify the present, and shape the desired future. It's the allure of deleting inconvenient pages from history books, silencing failed projects, firing those who speak of problems rather than achievements. The story of the Ninth Legion is a parable about what happens when the fear of disgrace becomes stronger than the pursuit of truth. A system that erases the memory of its mistakes deprives itself of its most crucial asset, immunity from repeating them. It becomes fragile, a colossus with feet of clay, which may appear indestructible but will crumble at the first serious blow because it has forgotten how to learn from its own bitter experience. Therefore, when we remember the Ninth Legion, we shouldn't just think about Romans and Picts. We should think about ourselves, about our own vanished legions, about projects that failed, about ideas that didn't work, about defeats we want to forget. The story of this phantom legion, marching through the centuries, is a stern reminder. Our failures are the most valuable part of our experience, and attempting to erase them from memory is not a way to preserve honor. It is the surest path to ultimate and inglorious disappearance. To fully grasp this story, we must make an intellectual leap, stop viewing events through the eyes of a Roman legionary, and try to look at the world from behind the blue war paint of a Caledonian warrior. The Romans called them Picts, the painted ones. To the Roman layman, this was a savage's mark, a sign of primitiveness. But for the Caledonians themselves, this paint wasn't camouflage, it was sacred raiment. It connected them to the spirits of their land, to their ancestors, to the gods of the forests and marshes. They weren't barbarians hungry for plunder. They were representatives of an ancient, complex civilization whose logic and truth were orthogonal to the Romans. Now, imagine the cultural shock their arrival caused. From their perspective, it wasn't an army that had invaded their land, but a kind of iron locust swarm. Insect people who moved in unnaturally straight lines, spoke a harsh, barking language, and were obsessed with strange rituals. They felled sacred groves to lay their absurdly straight roads. They defiled the land by digging perfectly square holes for their camps. Their motivation was utterly incomprehensible. Why did they want this cold, wet land? Why did they need to count people, tax them, force them to worship their distant gods? In the eyes of the Caledonians, the Romans were not bearers of civilization, but madmen who had disrupted the ancient order. They were a sickness that the earth itself had to expel. This conflict was far more than a mere territorial skirmish. It was a collision of two distinct realities. The Roman looked upon unorganized tribes, envisioning them as subjects to be subjugated, assimilated into their vast system, compelled to pay taxes, and conscripted into their army. The Caledonian warrior, conversely, beheld free individuals whose valor wasn't measured by marching in lockstep formation, but by personal bravery and unwavering loyalty to their clan and chieftain. The very notion of submitting to an impersonal, distant authority in Rome was not simply humiliating to them, it was utterly nonsensical. They fought not for empire, but for their hearths and homes, for the sacred burial grounds of their ancestors, for the fundamental right to live as they had for thousands of years. And this brings us to the tragic flaw of Roman predictability. The Roman war machine drew immense strength from its rigid order and impeccable logistics. Yet this very order became its greatest vulnerability. The Picts swiftly grasped that the Romans were prisoners of their own doctrine. They couldn't wage war without meticulously constructed roads. They couldn't survive without immense supply trains of provisions. They were compelled to construct a fortified camp every single evening. They operated strictly by the book, and that textbook the Picts had memorized cover to cover. For the Caledonians, this predictability wasn't a weakness. It was a veritable gift. They knew precisely where and how to strike. There was no need to assault the legion itself. It was enough to ambush a foraging party, which predictably set out each morning in search of grain. It was enough to lay a trap on a narrow trail where a stretched-out supply column slowly snaked its way. The Romans were like a colossal, armored, yet sightless cyclops, and the Picts were a pack of wolves, circling the giant, nipping at its exposed heels, patiently waiting for it to bleed out and collapse from sheer exhaustion. In the eyes of the Picts, there was no mysterious disappearance. The Ninth Legion didn't simply vanish into thin air, it was consumed. The very land it had come to conquer swallowed it whole. The forests, the bogs, the mists, and the people themselves, who were flesh of this earth's flesh, simply digested the foreign body and spit out the bones. For them, this was not a military campaign, but an act of natural purification, a restoration of a disrupted balance. So what ultimately doomed the Ninth Legion? Not the spears and swords of barbarians. It was undone by a collision with a reality that simply refused to fit into its worldview. The Romans arrived to conquer a land, failing to grasp that in Caledonia, the very earth itself was a warrior. They tried to impose their straight lines upon a world that lived by the laws of circles and spirals, and that world simply rejected them. Behind every grand historical narrative lies a personal drama, and the story of the Ninth Legion is no exception. At the heart of this drama stood a figure whose name history has all but erased, the Legate, the Legion's commanding officer. He was no villain or coward. He was a product of the system, an ambitious aristocrat whose career, and indeed his very life, hinged on success. And here, amidst the chilling forests of Caledonia, he confronted a moral dilemma of monstrous proportions. The choice wasn't between victory and defeat. The choice lay between two forms of ignominy: the shame of losing the Aquila, the Legion's sacred eagle standard, and being cursed for all eternity, or the disgrace of sacrificing his men to save that symbol, forever burdened by that secret. He chose the latter. The decision to dispatch a handful of his finest soldiers to save the Aquila, consigning the remaining 4,000 to certain doom, was no mere tactical maneuver. It was a desperate pact with the devil. Let us imagine this man. At the campaign's outset, he was the very embodiment of Roman certitude. Educated, having ascended every rung of the cursus honorum, he held an unwavering faith in the gods, in the Senate, and in the indomitable might of the Roman sword. For him, discipline was not merely a word, but a religion, and barbarians were nothing more than a vexing impediment on the path of civilization. He gazed upon the map of Caledonia and saw not a living, hostile land, but simply another province to be tamed, charted, and taxed. His world was logical, predictable, and utterly subservient to the will of Rome. But Caledonia broke him. Day after day, week after week, this land shattered his understanding of the world. The unseen enemy, the relentless rain, the rampant diseases, the ruptured supply lines, and worst of all, the growing unrest among his own soldiers. Confidence gave way to anxiety, and then to a deep, primal fear. The weight of responsibility, which once had spurred him on, now pressed down like a lead slab. He found himself utterly alone at the apex of a crumbling hierarchy. He couldn't reveal his weakness to his centurions. He couldn't confess his doubts to the legates of other legions. He'd awaken in his tent in a cold sweat, realizing that the system he so ardently believed in simply didn't work here. He was transforming from an idealist into a cornered pragmatist, for whom the goal of survival and salvaging his reputation began to justify any means. And not only nameless legionaries were sacrificed on the altar of this goal, loyalty itself was also offered up. Within his staff, there was surely a man who embodied the old Roman virtue, perhaps his primipillus, the most senior centurion. Let's call him Gaius. A veteran of dozens of campaigns, a man for whom the legion was not a number or an Aquila, but his soldiers, his boys. When the legate, in a war council, unveiled his desperate plan to abandon most of the men and save only the standard, Gaius surely revolted. He articulated what the legate himself feared even to contemplate. The legion is its people. An Aquila without a legion is merely a gilded bird. We will stand or fall together. In that moment, the legate perceived a mortal threat in his most loyal comrade. Gaius, with his stubborn nobility, could derail what seemed to the legate to be his only chance at salvation. And so, he made a second terrible decision. To silence Gaius and ensure the order was carried out, he assigned him the most honorable and utterly suicidal task: to lead the rearguard, covering the retreat of the group with the Aquila. He betrayed his best officer, sending him to certain death under the guise of bestowing the highest honor. He sacrificed the legion's conscience to save its symbol. The legate survived. The Aquila was saved. His career, perhaps, didn't utterly collapse. He might have been quietly shunted into an honorary but insignificant position. But what torment raged within his soul? For the rest of his days, he carried the knowledge that his official triumph, the saving of the Aquila, was built on betrayal and the blood of his own men. Every time he saw a statue of an eagle in the Forum, he recalled not the glory of Rome, but the doomed eyes of Gaius. The price of the Roman system's brilliance, which demanded the preservation of image at all costs, was paid with one man's soul and the lives of thousands. When Roman legions arrived in Britain, they brought with them not only swords and eagles. They brought an entire world, their laws, their gods, their architecture, their cuisine. And when this rigid, ordered Roman system clashed with the mystical Celtic civilization, something far more complex than simple conquest occurred. It was not a synthesis, but initially a fierce conflict of worldviews, a collision of two operating systems for reality. The Romans carved their unnaturally straight roads through ancient winding forests that the Celts considered sacred. They built their square forts and cities with grid-patterned streets on land where round huts and meandering hill-fort ramparts had stood for centuries. This conflict was particularly acute in the spiritual realm. Roman religion was state-sanctioned, public. It cemented the empire. Celtic faith was intimate, tied to a specific stream, hill, or grove. Its custodians were the Druids, not merely priests, but guardians of laws, poetry, and historical memory. For Rome, they represented a primary threat: political dissidents undermining imperial authority. And Rome acted ruthlessly. The massacre of the Druids on the Isle of Anglesey, as described by Tacitus, was not just a military operation. It was an act of cultural genocide, an attempt to excise the spiritual heart of Celtic resistance, to implant Roman gods in its place. But culture is impossible to fully extinguish. It seeps, it mutates, and it gives birth to something entirely new. The most astonishing and peculiar hybrid to emerge from this melting pot was religion. In the city of Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath, lay a sacred hot spring dedicated to the local Celtic healing goddess, Sulis. When the Romans arrived, they didn't destroy her sanctuary. Instead, they did something brilliant in its pragmatism. They identified her with their own goddess of wisdom and crafts, Minerva. Thus, Sulis Minerva was born, a new Romano-British deity worshipped by both Celts and Romans. They built her a magnificent temple in the Roman style, but within its confines, offerings and curse tablets continued to be cast into the sacred spring, just as their Celtic ancestors had done for ages. This process unfolded everywhere. Roman villas began featuring mosaics depicting Orpheus, but crafted with Celtic ornamentation. Local aristocrats adopted Roman names, donned togas, and spoke Latin, yet in their homes they continued to recount the old Celtic myths to their children. Latin became the language of power and commerce, but in the markets and fields, the Brittonic language continued to resonate. It was a schizophrenic, yet in its own way harmonious, reality where two cultures didn't so much blend as learn to coexist in the same space and even within the mind of a single individual. How did this transform the life of an ordinary Briton, say, a farmer from the Atrebates tribe? His world was turned upside down. Instead of paying tribute to a chieftain with grain and livestock, he now had to pay taxes with Roman coins. This compelled him to venture to the market, becoming part of a global imperial economy. For the first time, he tasted wine and olive oil brought from the distant Mediterranean. His son, perhaps, enlisted in the auxiliary forces of the Roman army and saw a world his grandfather couldn't even dream of. And in the neighboring town, an unprecedented center of public life emerged, the baths, where one could not only clean themselves but also catch up on the latest news and strike a deal. Old habits faded painfully. The power of tribal chieftains waned, replaced by impersonal Roman administration. Sacred groves were cut down, and nature spirits yielded to a pantheon of standardized imperial gods. But in return, something new arrived. Relative safety under the protection of the legions, the famous Pax Romana. Roads that allowed travel faster and farther than ever before, and the idea of law, uniform for everyone. Life at this intersection of civilizations was complex and full of contradictions. It was a world where you could offer a sacrifice to Jupiter for the emperor's health in the morning, and in the evening leave an offering for the old Celtic spirit of the stream to heal your cow. It was an era of compromise, adaptation, and the birth of a new, fragile, and short-lived, yet uniquely Romano-British culture. Rome was not just a war machine, it was a meaning-making machine. Every coin bearing an emperor's profile, every triumphal arch, every page penned by an official historian was part of a colossal propaganda campaign. Its goal was simple: to embed one unshakable idea into the minds of millions from Britannia to Syria, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The idea that Rome brought order, civilization, and crucially, was invincible. The disaster of the Ninth Legion became a critical bug in this system's code, a virus that threatened to bring down the entire edifice of the imperial myth. And Rome's reaction was not that of a warrior, but of a brilliant public relations manager. Instead of admitting defeat, Emperor Hadrian engineered the greatest publicity stunt in British history: his wall. It was the construction project of the century, diverting attention from inconvenient questions. The wall became not merely a border, but a gigantic press release carved in stone. Its message proclaimed, "We are not retreating. We are defining the boundaries of the civilized world. Everything beyond this wall is darkness, unworthy of our notice." In parallel, the quietest and most effective part of the campaign was launched, the aforementioned Damnatio Memoriae, the damnation of memory. The legion was not destroyed, it was edited out. It was struck from official documents, its number was retired. Rome didn't lose the battle for Caledonia, it simply declared that battle had never happened. But information warfare is never a one-sided affair. While Rome forged its myth of grandeur, the Picts were busy crafting their own. They had no historians carving marble arches. Their propaganda sang from the lips of bards around crackling bonfires on long winter nights. In these sagas, the Romans weren't valorous warriors, but arrogant fools, outsmarted by the very spirits of their native land. Tales of forests swallowing men of iron, of mists driving them to madness, were passed down through generations. These stories were a potent form of black propaganda against Rome, bolstering the spirit of resistance and painting the Caledonians as a people whom even the greatest empire couldn't break. Even within Rome itself, the official silence couldn't stifle the whispers. In the taverns of Subura, in the hushed corridors of the Senate, rumors surely swirled. Hadrian's political rivals might have seized upon this narrative to accuse him of weakness. Some claimed the legion was betrayed by inept leadership. Others whispered that the soldiers showed cowardice and were consequently disbanded. These rumors, this alternative history, have mostly faded from our grasp. For history, as they say, is written by the victors. But they existed, poisoning the official narrative and weaving an aura of shame and mystery around the Ninth. And this brings us to a prime example of how the official version diverges sharply from reality. Let's consider the event itself, the legion's disappearance. The official account, penned by the victor, is a void, a blank slate, absolute silence. But we have the vanquished's version, from the very survivors who bore the eagle. Their story isn't inscribed on papyrus. It's embodied in the artifact itself, the eagle of Silchester. This eagle, with its broken wings, buried in secrecy, is their silent manifesto. It's their counter-propaganda, reaching us across 2 millennia. It whispers to us, the official history is a lie. We weren't merely defeated, we were betrayed. Our flight was cut short not by an enemy, but by our own. Here lies our truth, buried in the earth. Thus, the battle for Caledonia unfolded on 2 fronts. The first, in the forests and fens, where Pictish spears clashed with Roman swords. And the second, no less crucial, on the battlefield of human memory, where imperial propaganda contended with oral legends and the mute testimony of a single bronze eagle. And as time has shown, it was on this second front that the vanished 9th Legion claimed its posthumous victory, forever etched into history, not as Rome had intended. The first point of no return was the military catastrophe within the Caledonian forests. But there was a second, far more profound and terrifying. This was the moment when the original vision, conquest and civilization, the expansion of the Roman world, was irrevocably warped. The ends no longer justified the means because the end itself had shifted. It became not the acquisition of new lands, but the desperate preservation of an illusion of invincibility. And the chosen means to achieve this was singular, total falsehood. The fatal decision that marked this turning point was the official, cold-blooded decree for the Damnatio Memoriae of the 9th Legion. This decision wasn't made in haste on a battlefield. It was forged in the quietude of inner chambers, amidst debates between the governor of Britannia and perhaps Emperor Hadrian himself. Here, far from Caledonia's blood and mire, an internal schism occurred, a fracturing of the very Roman soul. Let us imagine this dispute between 2 former allies. On one side stood Servius Tullius Crispus, a pragmatic administrator, a man of numbers and ledgers. His logic was impeccable and ruthless. The empire isn't merely an army, it's an idea of order and strength. If we admit that a single legion can be undone by a handful of barbarians, we'll send a signal of weakness across all frontiers. Rebellions will erupt on the Rhine, the Danube, in Judea. The stability of the entire empire is worth more than the memory of one failed legion. We must excise this tumor from our history. On the other side stood the old legate Lucius Cornelius Scipio, a man for whom honor and valor were more than mere words. He countered with the fury of an old warrior. Honor isn't what we proclaim about ourselves, it's what we do. We abandoned our soldiers to die, and now we wish to steal even their names. This isn't strength, it's cowardice. Rome's true strength has always been in facing defeat head-on, learning from it, and emerging stronger. By erasing the memory of the 9th, we betray not only the fallen, we betray the very essence of what it means to be Roman. In this debate, it wasn't military valor that triumphed, but cold, calculating statecraft. Crispus won. The notion that image trumped reality, that the myth of strength was more vital than strength itself, prevailed. And this was a betrayal of the fundamental idea upon which Rome was built. Republican Rome prided itself on its heroes and didn't shy away from its defeats. Imperial Rome, in its twilight, began to fear the truth. And here it is, the symbolic act that marked this turning point. It wasn't a grand event, no city razed to the ground. It was the quiet scratch of a stylus across a wax tablet in the archives of Londinium. Imagine an anonymous imperial clerk who received a sealed order. His task for the day, methodically erase all mentions of Legio 9 Hispana. He takes up the legionary rolls and scrapes away names. He takes supply reports for grain and burns them in a brazier. He takes maps with fort dispositions and wipes away the number 9. Each such gesture was an act of murder, the murder of memory. Thousands of names, stories, lives vanished into nothing, into a blank wax tablet, into a handful of ash. This was the second point of no return. The moment when the Roman Empire, in order to protect its facade, began to devour its own past, its own children. The grand idea of bringing civilization to the world devolved into a bureaucratic operation to conceal an inconvenient truth. And from that moment, its long, invisible internal decay began. Who won and who lost in this new world, demarcated by the stony scar of Hadrian's wall? The victors weren't the conquering warriors, but the engineers, logisticians, and administrators. A new elite emerged, the people of the wall, whose careers and wealth were built not on seizing new lands, but on managing colossal defense budgets. The old aristocracy, dreaming of triumphs and new provinces, found itself on the losing side. Their expansionist ideology was discredited, and on the frontier itself, new local potentates arose, chieftains of Roman-friendly tribes like the Brigantes, who transformed into wealthy and influential clients of the empire, playing the role of a buffer between civilization and the barbaric darkness. The losers weren't just the fallen legionaries. Their families were the primary victims. Imagine the wife, son, or father of a 9th Legion soldier somewhere in Hispania or Gaul. They received no casualty notices. They received no word of heroic demise. They didn't even receive a body for burial. Their loved ones simply vanished from the rolls, as if they had never existed. It was a tragedy without end, without catharsis, without the right to official mourning. An entire segment of society was condemned to perpetual ignorance, their personal history erased alongside the official one. Britain's economy was quite literally rebuilt on the bones of unfulfilled conquests. Gigantic resources, money, enslaved labor, legions of soldiers who were supposed to march north were redirected to one mega project, the Wall. This wasn't just a wall. It was Northern Europe's largest consumer of goods and services. Thousands of tons of grain, millions of liters of wine, endless caravans laden with tools, weapons, and building materials streamed towards the frontier. Northern Britain transformed from a wild outpost into a colossal construction site, and then into a permanent military base that, like a vacuum cleaner, sucked in resources from across the entire island. This completely reshaped trade routes and centers of power. If economic life once flowed along a south-north axis, following the advance of the legions, now the wall itself, stretching from west to east, became the main artery. In its shadow, new prosperous garrison towns like Luguvalium blossomed into hubs of trade and craftsmanship. Wealth was no longer synonymous with land ownership in the fertile south. Now, it could be amassed through army provisions in the rugged north. But the most profound shift occurred in people's minds. For a Roman soldier serving in Britannia after this disaster, the 9th Legion became a ghost, a chilling cautionary tale whispered in barracks. This spawned a peculiar frontier psychology, a mix of arrogance toward the barbarians beyond the wall and a deep, irrational fear of the wild, untamed nature that had managed to swallow an entire legion. The myth of Roman invincibility might have persisted in official propaganda, but here, at the edge of the world, no one truly believed it anymore. The entire Romano-British civilization experienced a collective trauma, the trauma of realizing its own limits. Hadrian's Wall, while offering a sense of security, simultaneously became a symbol of a cage. The world ceased to be an infinite expanse for expansion. It contracted to understandable, tangible borders. And beyond these borders now lay not a future province, but terra incognita, a land of myths, monsters, and eternal threat. People's worldview changed irreversibly. The euphoria of conquest was replaced by the anxiety of defense, and this anxiety would become the leitmotif of all subsequent Roman Britain's history, right up to its inglorious end. Behind the catastrophe of the 9th Legion and the construction of Hadrian's Wall, lay not merely military necessity or political calculation. Behind it all was a titanic shift in the very philosophical foundation of the empire. The idea that governed everything was simple yet revolutionary. For the first time in its history, Rome consciously said to itself, "Stop." For centuries, the empire had lived by the law of endless expansion, expansio. It was its nature, its religion, its very reason for being. But the disaster in northern Britannia was the final straw, proving that this path led to a dead end. The idea of expansion was supplanted by a new concept, stabilitas, stability. The goal became not the conquest of new lands, but the preservation and ordering of what was already held. The intellectual engine of this revolution was Emperor Hadrian himself. He was unlike his conquering predecessors. Nicknamed the Greek for his love of Hellenic culture, Hadrian was a philosopher on the throne. His thinking was shaped less by military tactics and more by the ideas of the Greek Stoics, particularly Epictetus, who taught how to distinguish between what is within our control and what is not. And Hadrian applied this principle to the scale of the entire empire. The endless, misty forests of Caledonia, inhabited by elusive barbarians, these were not within our control. This was chaos, pointless to try and order. But a clear, defended border, with prosperous and secure provinces behind it, that was within our control. Hadrian's wall was not an admission of defeat. It was a monument to Stoic reason, an act of supreme pragmatism, declaring, "We will focus on what we can control." This new rational philosophy stood in stark opposition to the old, almost mystical faith in Rome's destiny. This was the doctrine of the old guard, of senators and generals raised on the exploits of Caesar and Trajan. Their world was built on the concepts of virtus and gloria. For them, abandoning conquests was not pragmatism, but cowardice, a betrayal of the very idea of imperium sine fine, an empire without end. This clash of ideas tore through the Roman elite. The war party demanded vengeance for the 9th Legion, a new, even larger punitive expedition to wash away the shame with barbarian blood. The wall party, led by Hadrian, countered, "What's the point of losing another legion and spending billions of sesterces to conquer useless swamps when we have unrest on the Danube and in Judea?" It was this very struggle that sealed the fate of the 9th Legion. The decision to erase it from memory was a pure product of a new, cold, and pragmatic philosophy. From the perspective of the old doctrine of Gloria, the only honorable path would have been to celebrate the fallen heroes and avenge them. But from the vantage point of the new doctrine of stabilitas, the paramount concern was to prevent panic and preserve the empire's image of infallibility. The tale of an annihilated legion undermined stability, therefore it had to be eliminated. The bureaucratic eradication of the legion's memory became a logical, if monstrous, consequence of this new imperial philosophy. This philosophical upheaval wasn't confined to Britannia alone. Hadrian voluntarily relinquished Trajan's conquests in Mesopotamia, returning those lands to the Parthians. He fortified the empire's borders along its entire perimeter, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. His entire era was one of consolidation. Rome ceased being a predator constantly on the hunt for new prey. It became a gardener, finally resolved to bring order to its vast, overgrown garden by encircling it with a high wall. Thus, the tragedy of the 9th Legion was more than just a military defeat. It became a casualty of a grand philosophical war raging within Rome itself. It was crushed between two tectonic plates of worldviews, the receding era of boundless conquests and the encroaching age of pragmatic defense. Its fate was sealed not by the swords of the Picts, but by intellectual debates that forever altered the soul and strategy of history's greatest empire. The system Hadrian engineered, an empire of stable, fortified borders, seemed almost perfect. It granted Rome nearly a century of peace and prosperity, the golden age of the Antonines. Yet, no sooner had its great architects departed than this system began to crumble under its own weight. There was no single formidable external enemy that breached Hadrian's wall and surged southward. The enemy was already within. The system, designed to shield against external chaos, began to devour itself from within due to internal turmoil. The entropy of this system was embedded in its very foundation. Massive armies, concentrated along the frontiers, far from the political core, gradually transformed into states within a state. The legions stationed along Hadrian's wall fought the same enemies, year after year, under the command of the same legate. Their loyalty slowly shifted from the distant, faceless emperor in Rome to their own commander, who shared the hardships of service, led them to victory, and ensured their pay. The frontier ceased being merely a defensive line. It became an incubator for future emperors and usurpers. The wall, built to keep barbarians out of the empire, transformed into the perfect staging ground for legions to march from Britannia on Rome. And then began a brutal, bloody struggle for succession. Hadrian's grand vision of stabilitas was torn to shreds by ambitious generals, each interpreting it to their own advantage. True stability will only arrive when I rule. The crisis of the 3rd century became the agony of this system. Commanders in Britannia, Gaul, along the Rhine and the Danube proclaimed themselves emperors, leading their armies not against barbarians, but against one another. The empire Hadrian had so meticulously stitched together began to burst at the seams. The wall in Britannia temporarily ceased to be the frontier of the Roman world. It became the northern boundary of the separatist British Empire of the usurper Carausius, who minted his own coinage and conducted his own foreign policy. Each of these successors genuinely believed they were saving Rome. Clodius Albinus, governor of Britannia at the close of the 2nd century, led his legions into Gaul to battle Septimius Severus for the throne and lost. He bled the British frontier dry by withdrawing its finest troops, all for the sake of his version of stability. Thus, the grand concept of defense degenerated into its antithesis, fueling an unending civil war. Let us skip forward several centuries of agony and transport ourselves to the very end, to the turn of the 4th and 5th centuries. Roman Britannia, a mere shadow of its former self. And here, amidst the ruins of a once great system, we find its final fragment. This is no longer a Roman aristocrat, but a local Romano-British warlord, perhaps bearing a Celtic name like Artorius or Vortigern. He was born here. For him, the wall is not an imperial project, but the boundary of his homeland, his world. He still believes in Rome, in its laws and order, but the Rome he believes in no longer exists. His tragedy lay in his solitary attempt to prop up the sky. From the north, increasingly ferocious raids by Picts and Scots pressed against the wall. From the east and south, Saxon pirates landed along the coast. But the most devastating blow came from within. The last Roman usurper, Constantine III, withdrew the final regular troops from the island, leading them into Gaul to contend for the phantom title of emperor. Our hero and his militia were left alone. The system didn't merely abandon him, it yanked the last pillar from beneath him for yet another senseless political gamble. His end was predictable and tragic. He perished somewhere amid the ruins of the very wall he tried to defend, perhaps betrayed by his own mercenaries who realized there was no one left to pay them. With his death, more than just a defensive line died. The very idea of Roman Britannia perished. The wall, built as a symbol of eternal stability, became a tombstone marking the grave of an entire civilization. Hadrian's grand system didn't die from a single crushing blow. It bled out from 1,000 self-inflicted cuts. After the last legions departed, darkness descended upon Britannia. And this wasn't merely a poetic metaphor. Along with Rome went literacy. The technology of stone building, roads, aqueducts, and the very concept of a centralized state. Roman Britannia died. Its cities emptied, villas became overgrown with weeds, and mosaics vanished beneath layers of earth. Hadrian's Wall, a marvel of engineering, transformed in the eyes of the island's new inhabitants, the Anglo-Saxons, into an inexplicable cyclopean structure built by mythical giants. The memory of the Ninth Legion and its tragedy was buried beneath this cultural stratum, forgotten so thoroughly it was as if it had never existed. Just as Aristotle's logic was lost to Europe for centuries, preserved only in the libraries of Baghdad, so too did the memory of Britannia's Roman past survive not in chronicles, but in the distorted echoes of Welsh myths about King Arthur, the last glimmer of a vanished civilization. Centuries passed. Then, during the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered antiquity, a slow return began. But the rediscovery of Roman heritage in Britannia was not the work of kings or armies, but of a handful of eccentric enthusiasts, the antiquarians. Figures like William Camden in the 16th century spearheaded a true revolution. They stopped simply retelling myths. Armed with the writings of Tacitus and the maps of Ptolemy, they embarked on journeys. They walked along ruined ramparts, sketched half-erased inscriptions on stones, and tried to reconcile ancient texts with the actual landscape. It was a Herculean task to reconstruct a lost reality from dust and fragmented phrases. Then, in the 19th century, archaeologists succeeded the antiquarians. They began to dig, and the earth started yielding its secrets: fort foundations, pottery shards, coins, and of course weaponry. But here's the paradox. In unearthing artifacts, these individuals often buried the truth beneath them. New eras read Roman history entirely on their own terms, imbuing it with meanings that were never there. Victorian England in particular excelled at this. At the zenith of its imperial power, the British saw themselves in the Romans. They were not merely historians, they were fervent fans. And the story of the Ninth Legion became a perfect canvas for projecting their own virtues. In their interpretation, the Legion's disappearance ceased to be a story of bureaucratic deceit and slow attrition in the quagmire of a hopeless war. No, it transformed into a heroic epic, a hymn to imperial valor, resilience, and self-sacrifice. 5,000 British, that is, Roman, soldiers with truly English stoicism marched toward their destiny to bravely perish for the empire in a final battle against savage hordes. This version was beautiful, understandable, and, crucially, immensely flattering to a nation that was itself at that moment bearing the white man's burden across the globe. The culmination of this romantic reinterpretation was Rosemary Sutcliffe's novel, The Eagle of the Ninth, written in the mid-20th century. This brilliant book definitively transformed a complex historical enigma into a grand national myth known to every British schoolchild, a myth of honor, loyalty, and redemption. And this myth proved so powerful and compelling that for decades it overshadowed the painstaking work of archaeologists unearthing inconvenient facts, like roof tiles from Nijmegen in the Netherlands. The great legacy of the Ninth Legion wasn't just found, it was reinvented, and its second mythological birth proved far more resonant and influential than its quiet, terrifying historical disappearance. And so, we've come full circle. We began this investigation with a simple, piercing question. How could an entire legion vanish? We rejected the beautiful lie of a final heroic battle and journeyed into the past to crack the code of imperial silence. We followed the bloody trail left in the misty forests of Caledonia, descended into the cold archives of Roman bureaucracy, and ultimately found what we sought: the solution. We discovered it at the very heart of the imperial machine, in its fear of disgrace, in its willingness to sacrifice truth to preserve the myth of its own infallibility. We understood that the Ninth Legion wasn't annihilated by an enemy. It was obliterated by its own system, which preferred to erase it from memory rather than admit its weakness. Case closed, it seemed. Mystery solved. But precisely here, at the very end, the story takes an unexpected turn, returning to its beginning, yet on a new, deeper level. Observe what happened. In debunking the old heroic myth, we inadvertently created a new one. A myth of brilliant conspiracy, of soulless bureaucracy, of a great secret hidden for 2,000 years. Our story turned out to be no less captivating than the one we disproved. It simply became more complex, more modern, and therein lies the main, irresolvable paradox of this entire saga. Rome's quest for complete control over the memory of the Ninth Legion spawned a myth that became utterly uncontrollable. The more diligently they erased the traces, the deeper and more alluring the mystery grew. Their attempt to create an informational vacuum resulted in that vacuum being filled by a legend of such power that it outlived the empire itself. It was the very act of oblivion that granted the Ninth Legion immortality. We believe we are seeking historical truth. But what if truth is too dull, too prosaic for our consciousness, nurtured on grand narratives? What if reality is merely a succession of errors, poor logistics, incompetence, and unfortunate coincidences? We don't want to believe this. We demand either a heroic epic or a convoluted thriller. We are willing to accept any version except the most probable one, that it all happened due to foolishness and fear. And contemplating all this, the central question arises, to which I have no answer. In exposing old myths, are we truly seeking inconvenient, administrative truth? Or are we simply searching for a more intricate and fascinating legend to replace the old one? Is our consciousness even capable of accepting that history's greatest tragedies often have neither heroes nor villains, but only a succession of fatal compromises and bureaucratic reports, behind which lie thousands of shattered lives?